World War II witnessed one of the most extensive and brutal systems of forced labor ever implemented in human history. At the center of this system stood Nazi Germany, which created an unprecedented apparatus for exploiting millions of human beings from across occupied Europe. By August 1944, at the height of what the Nazis termed Ausländereinsatz, deployment of foreigners, over 7.6 million people were registered as forced workers within the German Reich. This staggering figure included approximately 5.7 million civilian forced laborers, 1.9 million prisoners of war, and over 500,000 concentration camp prisoners. The total number of people who passed through Germany's forced labor system during the war years exceeded 20 million individuals from virtually every corner of Europe. These men, women, and even children were torn from their homes, transported across borders in cattle cars, and forced to work under conditions that ranged from harsh to lethal. The system was not merely an economic expedient born of wartime necessity. It was deeply intertwined with Nazi racial ideology, which created hierarchies of suffering based on perceived ethnic and racial worth. The forced labor system played an absolutely critical role in sustaining the German war economy. Without this massive influx of coerced workers, Germany could not have maintained agricultural production to feed its population, could not have produced the weapons and equipment needed for the Wehrmacht, and could not have continued fighting as long as it did. By 1944, foreign workers and prisoners of war constituted approximately one-fifth of the total German labor force. In some armaments factories, forced laborers made up 60% of the workforce. This report examines the forced labor of prisoners of war within this larger system, with particular focus on the experiences of Soviet POWs in German captivity and German POWs in Soviet captivity. The contrast between these two groups illustrates not only the different approaches of the two regimes, but also reveals the devastating human cost of ideological warfare. The genesis of Nazi forced labor, from ideology to implementation. The Nazi system of forced labor did not emerge suddenly with the outbreak of war in 1939. Its roots lay in the ideology that had guided the Nazi movement from its earliest days. Adolf Hitler's concept of Lebensraum, living space, emphasized the conquest and exploitation of lands in the East. The territories to be conquered were seen not merely as geographical acquisitions, but as sources of raw materials, agricultural products, and above all, cheap labor to serve the German Reich. Even before the war, Nazi Germany had begun establishing a system of coerced labor. The early concentration camps, established in 1933, immediately put prisoners to work. Initially, this labor served primarily punitive and humiliating purposes rather than economic goals. Prisoners were forced to perform pointless, degrading tasks designed to break their spirits. However, as Germany began preparing for war, the economic potential of captive labor became increasingly apparent. By 1937, as Germany reached full employment and faced labor shortages due to rearmament programs, the Nazi leadership began viewing prisoner labor as an economic resource. The four-year plan, announced in 1936, created massive demands for construction workers, miners, and industrial laborers. The concentration camp system expanded to meet these needs, with new camps established near quarries and construction sites. Prisoners from Flossenburg, Mauthausen, and other camps were forced to cut stone for grandiose Nazi building projects. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 opened new vistas for Nazi planners. The rapid defeat of the Polish army resulted in the capture of nearly 1 million Polish soldiers. More significantly, the occupation of Western Poland placed millions of Polish civilians under German control. The Nazi leadership quickly decided to exploit this population. Almost all non-officer Polish prisoners of war, approximately 300,000 men, were forced to work in Germany. Additionally, Polish civilians were rounded up and deported to the Reich for agricultural and industrial labor. The Nazi approach to forced labor from the beginning reflected racial ideology. A clear hierarchy emerged, with Western Europeans receiving better treatment than those from Eastern Europe. French, Belgian, and Dutch workers, while still subject to coercion and hardship, were classified as racially superior to Poles and Soviet citizens. This racial calculus would reach its most extreme form in the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Operation Barbarossa. The catastrophe begins. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This massive military operation would prove to be the turning point not only of World War II, but also in the history of forced labor. The Nazi leadership viewed the war against the Soviet Union as fundamentally different from the campaigns in Western Europe. This was to be a war of annihilation, guided by racial ideology that classified Slavic peoples as Untermenschen, subhumans, and communism as a deadly threat to civilization. Hitler had issued guidelines for the treatment of Soviet prisoners in March 1941, 3 months before the invasion began. These directives called for the immediate execution of political commissars and Communist Party members found among captured soldiers. Soviet POWs were to be treated differently from other prisoners of war, with the Geneva Conventions explicitly not applied to them. The Soviet Union had not signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the Nazis used as justification for their brutal policies, although this was largely a pretext for actions they had already planned. The German military advance in the summer and autumn of 1941 was breathtakingly rapid. Soviet forces were repeatedly encircled and destroyed in massive battles. By the end of October 1941, German forces had captured approximately 3.35 million Soviet soldiers. The scale of these captures overwhelmed the Wehrmacht's ability to house, feed, or provide for the prisoners. However, this logistical failure was compounded by deliberate policy decisions rooted in Nazi ideology. The death of millions, Soviet POWs 1941 to 1942. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war in the first months of captivity constitutes one of the greatest crimes in military history. Between June 1941 and February 1942, approximately 2 million Soviet POWs died in German custody. This represents nearly 60% of all Soviet soldiers captured during this period. The causes of death were starvation, exposure to the elements, disease, exhaustion, and outright murder. The conditions in prisoner of war camps during this period defy comprehension. Captured Soviet soldiers were often marched for hundreds of miles without adequate food or water. Those who collapsed were shot. Upon reaching transit camps, prisoners found themselves in open-air enclosures with no shelter, minimal food, and no sanitation facilities. As autumn turned to winter, thousands died of exposure. The camps became killing grounds where the healthy gradually became emaciated and the weak simply perished. The daily ration provided to Soviet POWs in late 1941 often consisted of no more than 200 to 300 grams of bread, sometimes supplemented with thin soup. This was far below the caloric intake needed for survival, let alone for men who are often forced to perform heavy labor. By comparison, German soldiers received approximately 3,500 calories per day, and even civilian forced laborers from Poland received substantially more food than Soviet POWs. Contemporary documents reveal the scale of the tragedy. Between October 1941 and January 1942, estimates suggest that between 300,000 and 500,000 Soviet prisoners died each month. At some camps, the daily death toll reached 8,000 men. This figure is particularly shocking when one considers that it exceeded the total number of American and British POWs who died in German captivity throughout the entire war. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Prisoners suffering from dysentery, typhus, and other diseases received no treatment. The sick simply died in the camps, their bodies often left unburied for days or weeks. Mass graves were dug by those prisoners still strong enough to work, who knew they would likely soon occupy similar graves themselves. The mortality rate among Soviet POWs held inside Germany itself was equally appalling. By February 1942, at least 265,000 Soviet POWs had died on Reich territory, representing a death rate of approximately 53%. This figure is particularly revealing because it demonstrates that the horrific conditions were not simply the result of the chaos of the Eastern Front or difficulties with supply lines. Even prisoners who had been transported to Germany, far from active combat zones, died in massive numbers. The Wehrmacht's role in these deaths cannot be understated. While popular memory has sometimes portrayed the German military as separate from Nazi atrocities, historical research has definitively established the Wehrmacht's complicity. Army units were responsible for the initial capture, guarding, and transportation of prisoners. Camp commanders made decisions about food allocations, shelter, and medical care. At every level, German military personnel participated in or witnessed the mass death of Soviet POWs. The shift to economic exploitation. By December 1941, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The Soviet Union launched a major counteroffensive that drove German forces back from Moscow in chaos. The quick victory Hitler had anticipated was clearly not going to materialize. Germany now faced a prolonged war on multiple fronts, and the Reich's economy needed to be reorganized for total war. This strategic reversal forced a reassessment of policy towards Soviet prisoners. In January 1942, Hitler authorized improved treatment of Soviet POWs, not out of humanitarian concern, but because German authorities recognized them as a potential source of labor for the war economy. The labor shortage in Germany had reached critical proportions. German men were being conscripted into the Wehrmacht in ever larger numbers, creating gaps in agricultural and industrial production that threatened the war effort. The decision to exploit Soviet prisoners as forced laborers came too late for the millions who had already perished. Moreover, the improvement in conditions was relative. While rations were increased slightly, they remained far below what was provided to other POWs or to German civilians. Soviet prisoners continued to die at much higher rates than any other group throughout the remainder of the war. Between February 1942 and May 1945, an additional 1.3 million Soviet prisoners died in German captivity, representing 27% of those who had survived the catastrophic first winter. By comparison, the mortality rate among Polish and Soviet civilian forced laborers in Germany was under 10%, while mortality among Western Allied POWs was only 2 to 3%. The deliberate and targeted nature of German policy towards Soviet prisoners is unmistakable in these statistics. Types of work and working conditions. Soviet prisoners of war who survived the initial months of captivity found themselves deployed across the German economy. By 1944, approximately 2 million Soviet POWs were working as forced laborers. More than 1 million had been transported to Germany itself, where they worked within sight of the German civilian population. Their presence and suffering was not hidden. It was visible to millions of ordinary Germans. The types of work performed by Soviet POWs varied widely, but shared common characteristics. The work was heavy, dangerous, and performed under brutal conditions. In agriculture, prisoners worked in fields harvesting crops, tending livestock, and performing other farm labor. Agricultural work, while physically demanding, generally offered better chances of survival than industrial or construction work, as prisoners could sometimes obtain extra food. In mining, Soviet POWs were forced to extract coal, iron, ore, and other minerals essential to the war economy. Mining was among the most dangerous occupations, with high rates of injury and death from cave-ins, explosions, and exposure to toxic gases. The Donetsk Basin mining operations, authorized by Hitler in July 1942, were particularly deadly. Of the 48,000 prisoners assigned to these mines, most never even began their labor assignments, dying en route or shortly after arrival. Construction work consumed enormous numbers of prisoners. Soviet POWs built roads, bridges, airfields, and fortifications. Without their labor, the German military infrastructure in occupied territories could not have been maintained. Road-building projects in eastern Galicia were especially deadly, with prisoners working in all-weather conditions with inadequate clothing, minimal food, and brutal treatment by guards. The railway conversion project was vital to German military operations. Soviet railways used a wider gauge than German railways, requiring extensive reconstruction work to allow German trains to operate. Soviet POWs performed much of this backbreaking labor, laying new tracks across thousands of miles. Their work directly supported the German war machine, making them unwilling accomplices in the occupation of their own country. In German industry, Soviet prisoners worked in factories producing armaments, chemicals, vehicles, and countless other products needed for the war effort. Major German corporations, including Volkswagen, Siemens, Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben, Daimler-Benz, and others employed Soviet prisoners. These companies paid the SS a daily fee for each prisoner, making forced labor economically profitable for both the SS and private industry. The treatment of Soviet prisoners by German employers varied, but was generally harsh. At the Volkswagen factory in 1943, Soviet POWs received only 22 pfennigs per hour for their work, compared to 52 pfennigs for French workers and 27 for Italian workers. From even these meager wages, costs for food and housing were deducted, leaving the prisoners with virtually nothing. Living conditions for working Soviet POWs were appalling. Prisoners were housed in camps surrounded by barbed wire, often in drafty wooden barracks that provided minimal protection from the elements. Sanitation was inadequate, leading to the spread of disease. Medical care remained minimal or non-existent. Prisoners were constantly hungry, as rations remained insufficient even for those performing heavy labor. The racial hierarchy of Nazi ideology permeated the treatment of forced laborers. Soviet prisoners and civilian workers from the East were required to wear identifying badges, OST for Eastern workers, and special markings for Soviet POWs. They were forbidden from using public facilities, entering German homes, or having social contact with Germans. Sexual relations between German women and Eastern workers were strictly forbidden and severely punished. Guard detachments often treated prisoners with extraordinary brutality. Beatings were routine. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion or illness were sometimes shot on the spot. During transport to and from work sites, guards would shoot prisoners who could not keep pace with forced marches. At one transit camp at Gomel, guards shot between 15 and 50 prisoners per day from the work squads. In an especially horrific incident, guards staged a marathon race to select prisoners for transport to Germany, shooting the 200 men who collapsed along the way. The concentration camp system and Soviet POWs. In September 1941, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, began advocating for the transfer of Soviet prisoners of war to concentration camps under SS control. This represented a significant expansion of the concentration camp system, which had previously held approximately 80,000 prisoners. Himmler initially proposed transferring 100,000, then 200,000 Soviet POWs to the camps. By October 1941, segregated areas for POWs had been established at major concentration camps, including Neuengamme, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Gross-Rosen, Sachsenhausen, Dachau, and Mauthausen. The largest numbers were to be held at two new camps in occupied Poland, Majdanek and Auschwitz to Birkenau. These facilities were part of Himmler's broader plans for the colonization and Germanization of Eastern Europe. The first major group of Soviet POWs arrived at concentration camps in late 1941. Despite the SS intention to exploit their labor, most of the 25,000 to 30,000 who arrived were in such poor physical condition that they were incapable of work. Having survived the death camps of the Wehrmacht, they were now subjected to even worse conditions in the concentration camps. They received less food than other prisoners and were kept in worse accommodations. The mortality rate was catastrophic. 80% were dead by February 1942. At Auschwitz, the Germans began sending Soviet POWs shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union began. According to prisoner accounts, transports were arriving as early as July 1941. Initially, many arriving POWs were simply shot in the gravel pits near the camp. In September 1941, approximately 10,000 Soviet POWs were brought to Auschwitz and held in a special section separated from the main camp by barbed wire. A gate between the sections bore a sign reading Russian POW labor camp. The treatment of Soviet POWs at Auschwitz was exceptionally brutal even by the standards of that infamous camp. Upon arrival, prisoners were forced to strip naked near the railroad platform and immerse themselves in kettles of disinfection fluid before running naked to the camp. The autumn of 1941 was exceptionally cold with frequent snow. During the lengthy prisoner counts that could last hours, the men stood naked and freezing. Several days passed before they received clothing, and even longer before they were given blankets. The death rate among Soviet POWs at Auschwitz during the winter of 1941 to 1942 reached horrific levels. The causes of death listed in camp records, written in Latin or German to obscure the reality, included heart attack, circulatory failure, pneumonia, enteritis, and various other ailments. The reality behind these medical terms was death by starvation, exhaustion, exposure, and brutality. The extant death book of Soviet prisoners of war contains entries 5 to 10 minutes apart listing death after death. Soviet POWs at Auschwitz were forced to perform the hardest and most dangerous labor. They demolished and dismantled houses and villages cleared for camp expansion. They performed earth-moving and drainage labor in the marshy terrain, working in freezing water and mud. They built access roads and laid foundations for barracks. They worked without adequate clothing, with insufficient food, under constant harassment and torture by SS guards and prisoner functionaries who had been given authority over them. The Mauthausen concentration camp presented another horrific sight of forced labor for Soviet POWs and other prisoners. The camp was established in 1938 near an abandoned stone quarry. Prisoners were forced to carry granite blocks up more than 180 steps from the quarry floor. Small blocks weighed 30 to 45 pounds each. Larger blocks could weigh more than 75 pounds. Emaciated prisoners were forced to make this climb repeatedly throughout the workday. Those who faltered were beaten. Those who fell were often crushed by prisoners behind them or by guards who deliberately pushed men down the stairs. The quarry at Mauthausen was designed as an instrument of torture and extermination as much as a source of economic productivity. The policy of annihilation through work. The Nazi regime pursued what it explicitly termed Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through work or extermination through labor. This policy targeted certain categories of prisoners, including Soviet POWs, Jews, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi racial ideology. Rather than immediate execution, These prisoners were to be worked to death under conditions deliberately designed to cause illness, injury, and death. The policy of annihilation through work represented a cynical attempt to extract economic value from people destined for death. It allowed the Nazi regime to profit from prisoners' labor during the period between their capture and their eventual death from exhaustion, disease, or execution. The policy also had ideological dimensions, inflicting suffering on those the Nazis viewed as enemies while simultaneously serving the war effort. For Soviet POWs, annihilation through work meant assignment to the most dangerous and exhausting tasks. Beyond the quarries and mines, prisoners were used for mine clearance, removing unexploded ordnance and landmines from battlefields and occupied territories. This work was extraordinarily dangerous, and casualties were extremely high. Prisoners were often given minimal training or equipment and were simply sent into minefields with the expectation that many would be killed or maimed. In the final years of the war, as Germany came under increasing aerial bombardment, Soviet POWs and other forced laborers were used to clear rubble from bombed cities and repair damaged infrastructure. This work exposed them to the danger of unexploded bombs and collapsing structures. More significantly, forced laborers were given no access to air raid shelters during bombing raids. While German civilians took shelter, foreign workers remained exposed, leading to thousands of additional casualties. The massive underground construction projects of the late war period consumed enormous numbers of forced laborers. The Mittelbau-Dora camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald, was established to produce V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. Tens of thousands of prisoners, including Soviet POWs, were forced to excavate these tunnels in the Harz Mountains. Working conditions were appalling, with prisoners laboring in poorly ventilated tunnels filled with dust and lacking sanitation. More prisoners died constructing the tunnels and manufacturing the rockets than were killed by the V-2 weapons themselves. The human cost, statistics of suffering. The total number of Soviet prisoners of war captured by German forces during World War II was approximately 5.7 million men. Of these, roughly 3.3 to 3.5 million died in captivity. This represents a mortality rate of approximately 58 to 60%. To place this in context, this means that for every 5 Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, 3 died in captivity. The deaths of Soviet POWs represent the second largest group of victims of Nazi Germany, exceeded only by the approximately 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Moreover, these deaths occurred largely within sight of the German military, German civilians, and the occupied populations of Europe. This was not a hidden crime, but a visible catastrophe that unfolded across the landscape of Nazi-occupied Europe. The distribution of deaths reveals the systematic nature of the murder. Approximately 2 million Soviet POWs died in the Soviet Union itself, in transit camps and labor camps behind the front lines. About 500,000 died in the general government territory of occupied Poland. Approximately 400,000 died within Germany proper. Smaller numbers died in other occupied territories, including Norway, where 13,000 Soviet POWs perished in camps and labor sites. The mortality rate varied significantly over time, reflecting changes in German policy. The catastrophic period from June 1941 to February 1942 saw the highest absolute numbers and percentages of deaths. After the policy shift toward labor exploitation in early 1942, the death rate declined but remained far higher than for any other group of prisoners. Comparison with other POW groups highlights the deliberately genocidal nature of German treatment of Soviet prisoners. Italian military internees, who were captured after Italy's surrender in 1943 and were subjected to harsh treatment, had a mortality rate of 6 to 7%. Western Allied POWs had mortality rates of 2 to 3%. Only Soviet POWs experienced mortality rates above 50%. Conclusion of Part 1. The forced labor of Soviet prisoners of war in Nazi German captivity represents one of the greatest crimes of World War II. The scale of suffering, millions of men starved, frozen, beaten, and worked to death, challenges comprehension. The systematic nature of the crime, rooted in Nazi racial ideology and carried out by multiple institutions of the German state and military, demonstrates the depths of human cruelty that ideologically driven warfare can reach. The economic contribution of Soviet forced labor to the German war effort was substantial. By 1944, Soviet POWs and civilian workers made up a significant portion of the German labor force. Their labor in agriculture helped feed the German population. Their work in factories produced weapons used against their own countrymen. Their construction of infrastructure supported the German military machine. The exploitation of this forced labor allowed Germany to continue fighting longer than would otherwise have been possible. Yet the Nazi regime's ideological commitment to viewing Soviet prisoners as subhuman undermined the economic logic of forced labor. Prisoners who were deliberately starved and brutalized could not perform as effectively as properly fed and housed workers. The contradiction between economic exploitation and racial annihilation was never resolved. The result was a system that both profited from and destroyed the very labor force it sought to exploit. The complicity in these crimes extended far beyond the Nazi leadership and the SS. The Wehrmacht played a central role in the capture, imprisonment, and mistreatment of Soviet POWs. German corporations eagerly employed forced labor, paying fees to the SS and providing the economic demand that drove the system. Ordinary Germans witnessed the suffering of forced laborers in their midst, working in fields, factories, and construction sites, marching through streets, confined in camps within cities and towns. After the war, the suffering of Soviet POWs was compounded by the treatment they received from their own government. Soviet authorities viewed POWs with suspicion, seeing them as potential collaborators or traitors. Upon repatriation, many faced interrogation, accusations, and in numerous cases, conviction and imprisonment in Soviet forced labor camps. Some spent years in Gulag camps after surviving years in German captivity. This double tragedy meant that liberation did not bring freedom for many Soviet POWs, but only a different form of imprisonment. The story of Soviet POWs in German captivity during World War II is one that demands remembrance and study. It reveals the capacity for industrial-scale cruelty that characterized the Nazi regime. It demonstrates how racial ideology can transform warfare into genocide. It shows how economic systems can be built on human suffering. And it reminds us of the millions of individual human beings, soldiers who fought for their country, sons and fathers, brothers and husbands, whose lives were destroyed in this catastrophe. In Part 2 of this report, we will examine the mirror image of this tragedy, the forced labor of German prisoners of war in Soviet captivity. While the scale and systematic nature of the German crime was unique, the Soviet Union also exploited POW labor extensively. Understanding both systems provides a fuller picture of forced labor during World War II and its aftermath.